thing is, the crowd doesn't know that his predictions are plain nonsense. So plain random number, okay? And they rely on it for budgeting. So this is what causes deficits. So the IMF has a very destructive role on society because you have expert problem by incompetent economists making other people go, turn into turkeys, okay? So my idea is to build a society in which these people can be as charlatanic as they want without it endangering the welfare of normal citizens the second time. That's, for example, one of the problems I have with what I call faux expert. So they have caused a lot of damage just from that, not counting all the other damage they've caused from being faux experts.
Hugh.
Yeah. I think there was, however, another layer to that question, which is the role of America, and indeed how it's being supposedly superseded by our Chinese friends. And very much my take on Davos, the Copenhagen energy, global warming, etc., is we are now seeing great hubris emerging from the Chinese. And my warning to them is that any ambition to replace the US as the number one global power is going to require a kind of rethink, because if you go through history, global powers are benevolent and generous. If you remember the Monty Python sketch, what did the Romans ever do for us? They did a lot. The British Empire, the British parts of Africa are kind of a bit better than the Belgian parts of Africa, an example. And America has brought a lot. I tell you, you would not have a $4 trillion Chinese economy were it not for the benevolence of the American people. And I say this because American society is the only society that is willing to forgo jobs for the notion that they might trade instead and create a wealthy neighbour, and that there would be a mutual benefit. That is why you have a current account which gets where the Chinese have to buy dollars, because they know they could not recycle the current account surplus into Europe because we would have trade barriers. They can't do it in Japan. That's what I hope lay underneath that question you were asking.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. I think that needs to be emphasized here in this dialogue, is that if you look at NAFTA, I think that a lot of the world tries to be of the opinion with respect to the U.S. and U.S. foreign policy is that we're after oil. My goodness sakes, I lived in Mexico for 6 years. If we wanted oil, we'd go right across the Rio Grande and go get it. I mean, the point here is that I think there is a helping hand on the part of the United States to look after. Ultimately, it's going to play to the detriment of the U.S. Consumer, the U.S. Taxpayer. But there will be mean reversion here. I mean, we're after mean reversion in the global labor markets. It's a long-term trend, but it's coming on the backs of the U.S. consumer.
Well, but I'd like to contradict you a little bit in the sense that after 2001, when the U.S. really implemented expansionary monetary policies and kept interest rates artificially low, the desire of the U.S. was not to help the rest of the world. That I assure you. The desire of the U.S. was to avoid a deflationary recession in the U.S. And at the time, already Paul Krugman said the best for the world would be to have another bubble. He said it again recently. But they created the credit bubble, and the unintended consequence of the credit bubble was excessive consumption, which was not met by increased industrial production in the U.S. and increased capital spending in the U.S. So this overconsumption led to the trade and current account deficit, which are a symptom of overconsumption. Has nothing to do with the benevolence of the U.S. vis-à-vis the rest of the world. And so suddenly the Chinese began to produce goods, and employment went up in China, and capital spending went up in China, and they required more resources, and so commodity prices went up, and so the whole imbalance emerged. But basically, I think it's really exaggerated to say that China became only big because of the United States. I mean, For sure, U.S. monetary policies were not beneficial for the United States in the last 10 years because employment today is lower than it was in 1999. But it was highly beneficial for the rest of the world, including China and the resource-producing regions of the world. It gave them a kickstart. But from here onwards, I can tell you, as an example, Chinese exports to emerging markets are now larger than Chinese exports to the United States and to the developed world. So basically, the West has still this arrogance of looking at the rest of the world and believing that the rest of the world, the emerging economies, are small and insignificant, when in fact most consumer markets, consumer goods markets, are much larger in emerging economies than in the Western world. What is not accounted for in emerging economies very well is the service sector. And so consumption is grossly understated in GDP figures. But I mean, Hugh, I'm happy to argue with you later on over a beer on this subject.
I think an interesting point there is that from the policy side, the U.S. and much of the rest of the world is counting on China to play a new and more proactive role in the global economy, to shape policy. And in fact, other policymakers in the developed world are calling on China to start taking these policies which ultimately will help the global economy, to grow the pie. But this is the first time in history that we're asking an economy with per capita GDP of roughly 4,000 to take a leading role into the global economic policy landscape. And if you talk to the Chinese and you give them this type of framework, their rebuttal is that that they still view themselves as a poor country, as a developing country. So I think that the way the rest of the world views China, what we expect from China, and what the Chinese take from themselves is in many cases, a polar opposite.
If I can just... Michael, may I ask one follow-up question? May I ask the panel, because that is very important for Russia in the sense of the demand for resources. Is China a bubble, or is China no bubble? Maybe, Michael Power, you start, and then we move inside.
There may be times, brief times, when things get overheated, but broadly speaking, what's happening in China over the long sweep of history is not a bubble. It's something that's fundamental. It's driven by the rise of essentially the middle classes, where we're going to see middle classes increase from about 100 million in 2005 to 1.2 billion by 2025, if Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs is to be believed. That's the main thing. Just to add a point onto that is part of the problem at the moment is that the West generally doesn't feel China's doing much for them. But I can assure you in Africa, we think China's the best thing that's ever happened to us. In Latin America, it's goodbye Yankee and ni hao Chinaman. It's a very different perspective that you get in the rest of the world as to the role that China's playing. The West might think China is their worst enemy, and it's their new best friend in much of the rest of the world.
David?
I just agree. No, it's not a bubble. The prices are fully valued on securities, but the economy is on a long-term journey to world domination, just on the creation of wealth, population, as you alluded to. Fully valued this year. Buy on a dip.
How about you, Michael?
I would generally tend to share that sanguine view. On my way here to this conference, I came through Kazakhstan, which was the home of an extraordinary poverty bubble for a population of roughly 14 million people. Well, the reality is in China, due to the demographics, that roughly 14 million people go every year from the rural area to an urban area. So literally there, you can build it and expect that a year or 2 years from now that they will come. You build a bridge to nowhere, and the demographics are such that ultimately nowhere becomes somewhere. That's not to say that there isn't bubble-like characteristics in certain sectors of the economy, or that there isn't tremendous waste in certain allocations of resources, but ultimately the demographics are extraordinarily powerful, and it's tough to bet against.
Nassim?
I have no clue about China, but I have a clue about history. And I don't know if you were around at the turn of the century, and when you say what's a great country, the next great country was what? Argentina, not the United States. And we're still waiting for Argentina to become the next great country. So when people, all these stories about China may work, but believe me, in history, you only see the thing after the fact, not before the fact.
Hugh?
I love Jim O'Neill. I love that Goldman Sachs guy. You know, he says, you either get it or you don't. I don't get it. Okay. Now, I don't know if there is a Confucius saying, but I certainly know in the future there will be a Confucius saying that wise man not invest in overcapacity. Yeah? In overcapacity. Yeah? The flaw of the Asian business model is that at the center of it is a craving for power as opposed to profit. We have spent centuries dictating their affairs. They want to dictate our affairs. They achieve that through a current account surplus. They get to tell us what to do. But it is brought down by the subjugation of profit, the absence of profit, the socialization of bank lending. So in calling upon history and its portents, I am concerned because there are two previous episodes which they cast a shadow over today. They are periods in time which we describe as economic disequilibrium. A moment in time when a country became a creditor to the rest of the world, but continued to run persistent trade surpluses. That's not meant to happen. Trees are not meant to grow to the sky. There are meant to be countervailing forces, namely the currency rises. Yeah? That happened in America after the First World War. Became a creditor nation. Europe was bankrupt. America lent the money. America was the economic powerhouse, the engine. And America liked it. And there was a fixed exchange rate system called the gold standard. And what happened is the gold standard was pro-cyclical, and it created liquidity which went into asset prices. And what happened was first became last. Economics is an unkind profession. First became last. It took 50 years, but then it happened again. Japan became a creditor nation. Japan ran and continues to run a series of trade surpluses. But what happened? The liquidity again went into the Nikkei. And Japan, of course, has gone from being number one to being, of course, as Marc said in his introduction, very much last over the last 2 decades. So when I see the Chinese model, and I see its creditor status, and I see its desire and the reality of these persistent trade surpluses, which are nothing but mechanisms for creating credit which goes into asset prices, I fear the consequences. China could go from first to last. Consider that when you look at your portfolio.
Thank you. Ashot, do you have any view?
And the Chinese have an old proverb which I think largely reflects their views on life. And it sounds like this: it's better to be a tiger who everyone is afraid of than to be a dog that everybody loves. And I think that significantly explains the policy of China, and I agree with the previous speaker, and I believe that in the long run China would win, would gain, but as far as the rest of the world goes, there's a big question mark when China may become or can become the main creditor state.
Any further question from the back of the room? No, I'd just like to mention about China. My view is, of course, I'm not the leading expert on China, but I've been traveling to China also since the late 1970s. And, I mean, the progress has been really amazing. And if I look at the history of the United States, 1800 to year 2000, how many recessions